29 times, which was plenty, believe me. So I was all done being there. On the way down, the elevator stopped at the fifth floor. I got a little bit excited when Margaret got in and smiled at me. But then 1 second later, that Amanda Lee got in too. "Hi, Clementine. We're going to the mall," Margaret said. I turned around and pretended to be very busy pushing all the buttons until they got off. Then I went to my room and drew a picture of me at the mall with a lot of new best friends. Finally, it was time to go to the coffee shop, and I ran all the way, even though I probably had 2 broken legs from all that falling. When the clerk brought out the picture of Polka Dottie, my heart hurt so much I couldn't breathe for a minute. She looked so beautiful that big, and I missed her so much. I quick sucked in some air so I wouldn't faint, and then I said, "Thank you," and took Polka home, being careful not to fold her because she would have hated that. Seems like Clementine's very thoughtful. When I got to my building, I looked up and through all the pigeons. At the very top of the building was old Mrs. Jacoby's apartment. I tucked the big picture of Polka under my arm, took the elevator to the 8th floor, and knocked on Mrs. Jacoby's door. "Can I put this in your window?" I asked. "The one in the middle of your living room." Mrs. Jacoby said, "Why, certainly, dearie," without even asking why, and suddenly she didn't look so old or so boring. Probably because Clementine likes her now. I went to the window and opened it. When I looked down, I could see the backs of 1,000,000 cooing pigeons. Cuckoo! They covered every windowsill, every balcony, every ledge, every brick that stuck out even an inch. In between, I could see the sidewalk in front of the building, still wet from my dad's washing. I guess this was what my dad meant about seeing things from a different angle. But I didn't understand how I could help. Mrs. Jacoby came over beside me and shook half a box of Cheerios onto the windowsill. The pigeons flapped up in one huge gray cloud. Oh gosh, those pigeons are so hard to get rid of. I know that they don't want them there because the pigeons keep going to the bathroom, poo-poo, all over the building. And of course, they don't want that, right? So Clementine's trying to be clever by finding a way to scare off the pigeons. It doesn't seem like she scared them off yet. Let's see what happens next. Ah! Mrs. Jacoby is pouring Cheerios out to the pigeons based on this image. How does Clementine look here? She's like, it almost looks like she looks surprised. What's going to happen if Mrs. Jacoby has been pouring Cheerios out of the window? Do you think that's going to bring more pigeons? Seems like she's feeding these pigeons. Oh, we might have figured out the problem that Clementine and her dad have been facing. Where are these pigeons coming from and how can we get rid of them? And my brain snapped. Hey! Hey! I ran out of Mrs. Jacoby's apartment and all the way down to my own. 8 times 12 stairs, which equals 96. "Dad," I yelled, "what if the pigeons lived on the side of the building instead of in the front? Would that be okay?" "That would be great," my dad said. "A miracle. Except, of course, first you'd have to convince 1,000,000 pigeons to move." How do you think, you guys? How do you think that they could convince 1,000,000 pigeons to move? What was Mrs. Jacoby doing earlier that brought pigeons? But if I could, would that solve the problem? You wouldn't care if they messed all over the sidewalk in the side alley. Nope, not a bit. Nobody uses it. That alley could be knee-deep in pigeon splat, and nobody would even notice. Fire away, I'd say. And then I ran all the way back up the stairs to Mrs. Jacoby's apartment and went right inside since the door was still open, because that's how fast I was. She was so excited, that's why she ran so fast, huh? I'll run for your Cheerios every week, I told her. You won't even have to ask me. Every day if you want. But will you stop feeding the pigeons from here? Will you feed them from a side window instead? I took her into the dining room and showed her a perfect place. Let's start today, I said, and I sprinkled out the rest of the box of Cheerios. And even though pigeons have teeny tiny bird brains, they got the message pretty quick because right away a big flock of them flapped over. And it was even better for Mrs. Jacoby because this was her dining room. So now she could see those pigeons eating while she was eating. That's so thoughtful. And then I was all done being there. So I ran back home to tell my dad the good news. He and my mom were in the kitchen starting dinner. So I told them, and I told them, and I told them. And my dad kept saying, "Way to go, sport." And my mom kept saying, "Thank goodness. Now you don't have to spend your life cleaning up after those pigeons." They were so happy. But my parents were sneaky too. Somehow, while I was telling them about Mrs. Jacoby, one of them slipped me a colander of green beans and brainwashed me into snapping them. Aw, how does the family look there? They look much happier than in the first picture. Well, at least Clementine does. And her parents look like they're looking at her and they're smiling. And I remember in the last chapter, we found out that Clementine didn't really know what her parents said, right? She was a little worried about what they were talking about before she got there. So it seems like things are looking up and they're really proud of Clementine for figuring out a solution to a big problem that their family was facing, right? That there were all these pigeons and they were making a mess in the front of the building. Now, how did Clementine help them solve that problem? Scholars, you will notice that in chapter books, there might be small problems and small solutions throughout, right? This was one problem in the story, right? The pigeons were making a mess. And look, there was a solution, even though we're not near the end of the story. So, in chapter books, there are many problems and many solutions. There's oftentimes one main problem and one main solution, right? The biggest ones, but there are little ones throughout. What problem was solved in this chapter?